Report Chapter 017 Sympathy for the Spider. For a moment, silence reigned, both literal and mental, as Zorian stared into the unblinking eyes of his adversary. Zorian wasn't one of those people who had a phobia of spiders, but it was hard not to be intimidated by a creature that could read your thoughts and have you completely at its mercy due to induced paralysis. He couldn't even try to physically overpower the effect, since the paralysis was a purely mental one. He was quite literally locked out of control of his own body. The situation wasn't completely hopeless. As a mage, Zorian was resistant to mind reading almost by default. The ability to clear away stray thoughts and emotions, and otherwise discipline their mind, was a must for any aspiring mage. That said, controlling your thoughts for long periods of time was tiresome. It was only a matter of time until a stray thought escaped him and he slipped. An important secret to the blasted spider. And resistance to mind reading would do him no good if the creature grew frustrated with his resistance and decided to take a metaphorical sledgehammer to his mind. In the end, the spider decided to speak first. Or rather, communicate telepathically to him first, as that appeared to be its only method of talking to him. It made sense, really. The spider had no recognizable mouth from which to speak out of. "You're untrained," the spider opinionated. "It's a pity. I would have loved to trade techniques with a human psychic. I suppose it's to be expected, though, considering the unhealthy attitude towards mind magic your species has." "What? Why the confusion? You cannot possibly be ignorant of the gift," the spider said, torn between befuddlement and amusement at the thought. "See, right there. You just sensed my emotions. What do you think that is, if not empathy?" Zorian's brain froze for a moment. Him, an empath? That was ridiculous. He was neither social nor pleasant enough to be empathic. What a strange chain of thought, the spider mused. Ernia like me are all open, yet there are plenty of loners and unpleasant individuals among us. I'm sad to say that some even use their empathy to purposely promote discord within the web. Zorian's mind was momentarily aflame with possibilities before he forcibly reined himself in and shoved those trains of thought into the back of his mind. Focus. This was a horrible time for getting distracted. He had a far more serious issue to think about. "You must be mistaken," Zorian thought back, knowing that the spider would pick up on his thought. "It's far more likely you accidentally attached some of your emotions to the telepathic message you sent me." "There is no need to be insulting," the spider immediately sent back. "I am an Arania matriarch. If I had attached something other than speech to our communication, it wouldn't have been by accident. But never mind, if you want to deny the obvious truth of your empathic abilities, I'll play along for now. What I want to know is what your quarrel is with my web. As far as I know, we've never done anything to you, so I'm baffled as to why you felt the need to sick the enforcers at us. What was Shio?" The warning he gave Taban to watch out for telepathic spiders and the subsequent search for the creatures by the enforcers. Right. Of all the things he had been worried about during this past week, having the spiders track him down for setting enforcers at them had never even entered his mind. Funny how these things worked. "I'm not sure if you'll believe me, but I never intended to send the enforcers after you," Zorian sent. "All I did was warn a friend to watch out for you when she went to the sewers. It all seems to have spiraled away from there. Why wouldn't I believe you? I am literally reading your mind as we speak," the spider noted. "But that still doesn't explain how you even knew about us. We tend to be a tad secretive. Or, for that matter, why you felt the need to warn your friend to watch out for us, since we don't really attack humans without provocation." Well, crap. How can he possibly explain that without revealing anything sensitive? "I suppose this is something related to this time loop you're trapped in, then?" the spider asked innocently. Zorian would have grit his teeth if he could. Damn it, how? He pointedly didn't think about that. Your ability to control your train of thought is fairly impressive for an amateur, but it is a form of mental defense that only works if you know your mind is being read. I observed you and your group for quite a while before I executed this ambush. And while you were open, and thus hard to read covertly, Your friend and sister are virtually defenseless against my powers. They didn't even notice while I was trawling through their memories, much less when I skimmed their surface thoughts. Zorian felt like slapping himself for such an obvious oversight. Of course, sharing his secrets with the likes of Kirill would come back to haunt him. A secret is only as secure as its weakest link. He considered the situation for a moment before giving a mental sigh. It was hopeless. The spider had completely outmaneuvered him, and currently had him over the barrel. The creature seemed reasonable enough, but he would have almost preferred that it was murderous. He could recover from death easily enough, but the things a skilled mind mage could do to him would linger with him on subsequent restarts. Your insistence on viewing me as an uncompromising threat despite no hostile moves on my part is honestly getting rather tiresome, the spider said, and Zorian detected a distinct note of annoyance in her bearing. Zorian idly wondered how the esteemed matriarch would describe her current ambush and her gross violation of his friend's privacy if not as hostile. I came here to talk, not fight. The enforcers hadn't even managed to track us down, much less dispatch any of us, so there is no reason for hard feelings on my part. This isn't a revenge run, it's an attempt to defuse a situation before it spirals out of control. I know our kind looks frightening to your eyes, but please stop thinking of me as some slavering beast out to eat you or some sadist intending to torture you into insanity for absolutely no reason. We're no worse than humans, really. I'm not sure that sets me at ease. Humans can be pretty horrible, Zorian noted. But I see your point. So what now? The enforcers will get tired of their search quickly enough and leave you alone, and I have no intention of taking any further action against you and your web. Problem solved, then? Well, yes, the spider agreed. But in the process of confronting you I found something 100 times more interesting than a human kid with a grudge. You don't really think I'm going to just ignore the whole time loop business, do you? I was kind of hoping you would, actually, admitted Zorian. It's not really your concern. Oh, I beg to differ, the spider interjected. I just found out I'm being effectively memory wiped in regular intervals. I am greatly concerned. Zorian racked his brain for a response that could dissuade her from getting involved but gave up after a couple of seconds. He was getting an impression of resolve and stubbornness from the spider, and had a feeling all of the arguments he could marshal were doomed to fall on deaf ears. He didn't know how he could read a giant spider's body language, but apparently he could. Maybe there was something to her claim of him being empathic. Look, Zorian tried, if we are going to have a serious conversation about this I would really appreciate if you released me from paralysis. This is very uncomfortable and I'd be a lot friendlier if I weren't frozen like this. I don't trust you that much, the spider told him bluntly. All you have to do is scream and things could get uncomfortably messy. I'm not going to do that, Zorian assured. That would just put my sister and friends in danger. I'm sure you could handle anything anyone in this house could throw at you. Well, I'm not. I've lived too long to underestimate mages, the spider said. Tell you what, though. Why don't I simply let you go for now and leave? Later, when you calm down a little, you can descend into the city tunnels and track me down for a nice friendly chat in neutral territory where we both feel a lot safer. That sounded like a great idea, actually. Well, except for the question of why. Why would you bother tracking me down when you can just pretend this never happened and ignore my existence entirely? The spider surmised. Well, for one thing, I can tell you're interested in what I mean by you being open, no matter how hard you try to hide it. You will never get a satisfactory answer unless you seek me out. Secondly, there is a reason why I accepted the idea that you're trapped in a time loop without dismissing you as crazy. I have important clues that could help you solve this puzzle and break out of the loop, but I'm not sharing them until I get something in return. I'm sure we can agree on a fair price. And finally, working with me isn't just going to be an unnecessary chore like you seem to think. I am a leader of a shadowy group of mind-reading spiders that have their feelers throughout the entire city. Surely you can see how a group like that could be useful in making sense of this event? Zorian swallowed heavily as he finally realized the seriousness of the situation he was dealing with. Her group was that big and organized. He knew the spider before him was a representative of a larger group since she introduced herself as an Arania matriarch, but he thought it was just a loose pack consisting of a dozen spiders or so at best. Suddenly the pitch-black eyes staring at him seemed a lot more threatening than they were just a moment ago. Gods, what had he gotten himself into? I'm glad we were finally able to understand one another, Zorian Kaczynski. Rest now, and we will talk when you're less tense. Zorian suddenly felt a smothering blanket of telepathic force press itself gently but firmly against his mind. He tried to resist, but the mental attack seemed to ignore his mental defenses entirely. Despite valiant efforts, Zorian soon blacked out. When he woke up a few minutes later, he was alone in the room and there was no trace of giant spider anywhere in the house. Afterwards, Zorian thought long and hard about the matriarch's offer and ultimately decided he really didn't have much choice. He somehow doubted she would patiently wait for him if he ignored her for too long, and raising a fuss about her actions would attract unwanted attention to him and might cause the matriarch to retaliate out of spite. And since she knew about the time loop, she was bound to pick something that would haunt him beyond the confines of this particular restart. Of course, there was also the fact that some of the things she said during their brief exchange interested him greatly. The potential benefits of hashing out a deal with her were simply too great to ignore. That said, he had absolutely no intention of rushing to the damn spider at the earliest opportunity. That would just make him seem desperate. Let her wait for a while. It was a good idea to do some preparations before confronting the matriarch, anyway. First of all, he needed to know more about these Aranya he would be meeting with. His previous searches for information about the spiders left him empty-handed, but now he was armed with an actual name of the species and his search was much more successful. He found plenty of descriptions, though they were of much poorer quality than he had hoped. Apparently Aranya were considered semi-mythical due to their rarity and there were many conflicting reports circulating about them. Everyone agreed they were sentient and magical in nature, but from there the details diverged wildly. Depending on the author, all sorts of powers were attributed to them, from the ability to assume human form to the ability to manipulate shadows and other, crazier abilities. Zorian could see three possible explanations for this. 1. The Aranya had a dizzying number of subspecies, all with a wildly different appearance and abilities. 2. The authors were making stuff up. And 3. The Aranya were mages in the human sense, armed with a flexible spellcasting system capable of producing a wide variety of effects. Knowing his luck, it was definitely number 3, the most worrying of possibilities. A group of one-trick ponies limited to mind magic was a dangerous foe, but one that could be countered with enough preparation. A group of mages utilizing a completely novel spellcasting system whose limitations he was unfamiliar with. That was practically the definition of unpredictability. Still, the Aranya he had met never gave any indication of knowing any magic beyond the mind-based one, so maybe this group specialized in the field or something. Having a way to deal with their mind-affecting abilities was certainly a must before going off to confront them. One of the books also suggested Aranya were vulnerable to light-based attacks, being nocturnal in nature and lacking eyelids. It sounded plausible to Zorian, and he was pretty sure his spell formula skills were sufficient to cobble together some flash grenades. A few more general defensive measures and he should be set. Well, as set as a mage of his own caliber and resources could possibly be, it wasn't much, but it would hopefully buy him enough time to flee if things turned sour. The other thing he was trying to puzzle out was the matriarch's claim that he was an empath. The idea seemed so wrong to him. The stories he'd heard about empaths painted an image of a compassionate, sociable person possessing great wisdom, respect for tradition, and lots of friends. Zorian didn't really fit this mold. Did that prove anything, though? Empaths were so rare, among humans, at any rate, that any sort of fact about them was suspect. As strange as it may sound, he rated the opinion of a giant telepathic spider higher than those of human authors. If he really was an empath, however, why didn't he? Well, know it. You'd think the ability to sense other people's emotions would be very obvious. He supposed it was possible that his abilities were too weak and erratic to manifest themselves in an unambiguous fashion. which raised the question, how to discern the truth, then. Fortunately, empathy wasn't a particularly sensitive topic, so nothing stopped him from asking Elsa or other teachers for help and information. Before he did that, however, he decided to try looking for help closer to home. He had noticed their landlord had an interest in esoteric branches of magic, even though she wasn't a mage herself. She had enough books in her house to stock a small library. It wouldn't hurt to ask, he supposed, and Amaya was a lot more approachable than anyone else he could reach. He approached her while she was washing the dishes one evening. "Miss Karashka, could you spare a minute?" he asked. "I'd like to talk to you about something." "I told you to call me Amaya," she said, halting her task long enough to give him a mild glare. "And of course I can talk to you, but I have to finish this first. Pull up a chair and wait till I'm done." Instead of doing that, however, Zorian moved to help her with her task. She'd be done quicker with him helping her out, and it was a cheap way to score some points with her before asking for help. She seemed momentarily surprised by his gesture, but recovered her composure quickly and continued on as if his action was totally expected. Once they were done, Amaya sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for Zorian to join her. "So," she began, "what exactly is weighing so heavily on the mind of my grumpiest tenant that he would come to me for counsel? The way you've been avoiding me this whole time, I almost thought you hated me." "I don't hate you, Miss K." Amaya," finished Zorian, correcting himself after seeing her cross look. "I've just been pretty busy, that's all. Carol kind of monopolizes all of my free time here. She is quite a handful, isn't she?" Amaya said speculatively. "Still, I can't see what a busy boy like you would want from me. You aren't trying to seduce me, are you?" "What? No," sputtered Zorian. She was at least twice Zorian's age, for heaven's sake. "I am not." He stopped himself when he saw the barely restrained mirth emanating from Amaya. "Very funny, Miss Karashka," he deadpanned, deliberately not calling her Amaya to spite her. "Very, very funny." "It was from my perspective," Amaya said, laughter dancing in her voice. "But I can see you don't take jokes at your expense too well, so let's just move on to the reason you sought me out." "Well," started Zorian, pointedly ignoring her remark about him being too sensitive about jokes. "It's actually magic-related. I noticed you have a lot of books about esoteric magic in your home." "It's a hobby of mine," Amaya said. "I always did have an interest in magic, especially the rare kind. I even went to a mage academy as a teenager, much like you did. That's how I met Elsa. Actually, we were classmates back then. But that was a long time ago." Zorian nodded, accepting her last statement for what it was, a request not to pursue the topic further. He was fine with that. "So I assume you read all these books then?" he asked. "Each and every one of them," she confirmed. "Did any of them perhaps relate to empathy?" Zorian asked. "Specifically, how can you tell if you're an empath yourself?" "I did read something about that topic, though I don't have the book in question here with me." She gave him a curious look. "Why? Fancy yourself an empath?" "Well, maybe," admitted Zorian. "I mean, it doesn't sound very likely to me, but I met an actual empath recently, and she seemed sure I was one too. So I don't feel comfortable with just dismissing the possibility." Amaya hummed. "And why do you think it's so unlikely if you've been told that you're one by another empath? Shouldn't empathy be pretty obvious to the one who is it?" Zorian asked. "Well, it's not obvious to me. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that would indicate I am one." "Nothing?" Amaya asked curiously. "I find that hard to believe. The indicators of being an empath are so common and mundane that false positives tend to be a major problem. In fact, a lot of experts insist that there is nothing supernatural about empaths, that some people are simply a lot better at reading people's body language and environmental cues than most of humanity. It's far more likely that you're just ignoring the signs. For instance, can you honestly say that you've never had an instinctive feel about a person you just met?" "Well, no, I can't say that," Zorian admitted. I get feelings like that all the time. That isn't anything unusual, though. It might be, Imaya said. Just how often do you get such hunches and how reliable are they overall? Zorian hesitated. I get those feelings pretty much every time I talk to someone. They tend to be pretty accurate from what I can tell. Why? Is that so unusual? Imaya gave him a speculative look. A bit, yes. Every time you talk to someone, you say, "How about random strangers minding their own business?" Do you get these feelings about them too? Sometimes, admitted Zorian, shifting nervously in his seat. Some people have really intense personalities, you know. You can pick them out of a crowd from the other side of the room without even trying. Interesting. How about groups of people? Can you make a spot judgment about the mood of a group without speaking to anyone? Well, no, said Zorian. Frankly, the pressure crowds out all other sensations when I'm in a large enough group. If I'm subjected to it long enough, I lose even the ability to make judgments about individuals, much less the group as a whole. The pressure? Imaya asked, giving him a baffled look. It's a personal problem, fumbled Zorian. Every time I enter a big enough crowd, I feel this weird mental pressure that gives me a headache if I stay inside long enough. Zorian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hated telling people about the pressure thing, since most people immediately assumed he was either delusional or making things up. His family, for instance, had never believed him when he tried to describe the phenomenon to them as a child, believing instead that he was making things up so he wouldn't have to follow them to their various social events. Eventually they grew tired of his claims and threatened to send him to a madhouse if he didn't admit he was lying, so he never brought the issue up again. That's an interesting problem, Imaya said carefully. Tell me, is the pressure constant or does it vary according to some criteria? It varies, said Zorian. The more people there are in the crowd and the more densely they're packed, the stronger it is. It's also stronger if the crowd is. He trailed off as he suddenly realized something. Gods, he was so stupid. Yes? Imaya prodded. If the crowd is what? Emotionally charged for some reason, finished Zorian lamely. A short silence descended on the scene, before Zorian rose from his seat and began angrily pacing around the room. Your empathic abilities are so strong that you literally feel the emotions of a crowd as tangible mental pressure bearing down on you, said Imaya after watching him pace around for a while, and you think there is nothing to indicate that you're an empath. It's not that easy. How was I supposed to know what the pressure was? Zorian protested, nervously running his hand through his hair. It's just there. It has always been there, a constant annoyance that was with me ever since I was a child. Do you have any idea the sheer amount of trouble this thing has caused me? Isn't empathy supposed to be a boon? Most of the time I did my best to ignore it, vainly hoping it would go away in time. Well, yes, Imaya agreed. Empathy is usually depicted as a great gift to the person who has it. But there are plenty of reports of empaths whose powers are so strong or volatile that they are crippled by them instead. Considering some of the horror stories I've read about, your case is relatively mild. It could have been worse. It could have been worse. That could easily serve as a summary of his entire life so far. Oh well, there had to be a way to rein in his errant empathic abilities somehow, and he had plenty of time to find it. The Ernie probably knew how, though he suspected he wouldn't like what they would ask in return. Zorian? Imaya asked after a few moments of silence. I can see this as a somewhat sensitive topic for you, but can I ask you a question? Well, 2 questions really. Sure, agreed Zorian. She did end up helping him, even if he didn't imagine her help to play out the way it did, so the least he could do was satisfy her curiosity. I get the feeling that you didn't like the idea of being an empath, even before you knew what you do now, she said. Why is that? Maybe I am projecting somewhat, but I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to possess an inborn magical ability. I hope you don't think you're a freak just because. No, it's nothing like that, Zorian quickly assured. I know a lot of civilian-born students react badly to anything that may make them abnormal. But I'm not like that. No, the real reason I didn't like the idea of being an empath is far more stupid than that. Actually, I'm kind of embarrassed to even admit it, so can we just move on? No, Imaya said, a smirk on her face. This I definitely got to hear. Zorian rolled his eyes. Served him right for admitting it was embarrassing. Oh well, it's not like she'd remember this conversation once the loop reset. Alright, but you can't tell this to anyone, okay? Imaya mimicked sealing her mouth shut. It's because empathy is usually portrayed as a feminine ability, one reserved for girls and girly men, admitted Zorian. Ah, nodded Imaya. Of course a boy would be bothered by something like that. I'm not sexist or anything, Zorian hastily added. But I already receive a lot of comments about my supposed lack of masculinity, and they're annoying enough as it is. I really don't want to see how bad they would get if they had this sort of proof. His family was the worst offender in that regard, especially his father, but he would keep that little tidbit to himself. I won't tell anyone, Imaya said. And if it makes you feel any better, there is no evidence that empathy manifests itself more often in women than it does in men. I figured, Zorian said. Very few magical abilities are gender-specific, unless they're artificially designed to be that way. And I also think those people have no idea what they're talking about, Imaya said with a supposedly innocent smile that had a hint of mischievousness behind it. I think you're a very handsome young man who will someday make some girl very happy indeed. Thanks. What was the other question you wanted to ask, again? Said Zorian, trying to change the subject to something less embarrassing. She had her fun, no need to torture him further. I assume you will try to develop your ability further? Imaya asked. Zorian nodded. In that case, I'd like you to keep me informed about your progress. I find stuff like this incredibly interesting. Zorian agreed, though it was essentially an empty promise. She would remember none of this after the next restart. Their conversation done, Imaya returned to her household chores and Zorian went back to his room to plan his visit to the area. He really didn't want to find out what the matriarch would do to him if he didn't show up soon. Break. Well, this is it, Zorian said out loud, standing in front of the entrance to the sewers. The matriarch didn't tell him where exactly in the sewers she hoped to meet with him, but he knew where he had met the spiders the last time he had been down there, so he intended to start from there. The point of no return. I once again offer you the chance to turn back. You don't have to risk your life with me, Kale. He gave a pointed look to the Morlock following after him, trying to use his newly recognized empathic abilities to gauge the other boy's mood. Sadly, the boy's emotions were too well controlled at the moment and his control over his empathy sucked. Regardless of how Kale truly felt about this trip, he was clearly determined to see it through. Why, Zorian didn't know. When he told Kale about the Arania matriarch's ambush and the resulting conversation, he did it because he wanted to have someone to bounce ideas from and Kale seemed like the best choice. He already knew about the time loop and he was clearly very intelligent, not because he had wanted Kale to come with him. Kale, on the other hand, insisted that coming alone on such a meeting was the height of idiocy and that Zorian needed a partner to cover him. Zorian reluctantly agreed, not entirely comfortable with risking someone else's life in this thing, no matter how logical it was. Kale seemed amused that Zorian cared more about his safety than his own, considering that Kale would be restored to normal once the loop restarted and Zorian might not be, but Zorian's moral sense had yet to adapt to the implications of the time loop and he was horribly bothered by the idea of leading Kale to his death in the tunnels and leaving his daughter all alone in the world. Even if it was only for a week or so. I told you to drop it, Kale sighed. I'm definitely going with you. If nothing else, then so this Arania matriarch and I can have a conversation about ethical uses of mind magic. Alright. Kale was still kind of bitter that the spider searched through his memories in her quest to piece together what Zorian's motives were. Finally, they descended into the tunnels, Zorian leading the way. He chose his way carefully, occasionally leaving a magical trap behind them in the form of stone cubes covered in spell formula. If they had to flee, the traps should be able to surprise any pursuers by backtracking where the traps were. Most of them simply erected a force field to delay the attackers, but a couple had more aggressive effects. At the very least, it should force the pursuers to slow down in order to deal with the cubes and give them enough time to reach the surface. Kale, meanwhile, was their anti-mentalist support. He had put a mind shield spell on himself, and would remain under the spell's effects constantly. If the meeting at any point turned sour, Kale would immediately cast the spell on Zorian as well. Kale seemed sure that the spiders had a method of communicating with humans other than telepathy and suggested that they both use the spell right from the start, but Zorian knew he had to keep his mind open if he wanted these talks to be in any way productive. His instincts, which Zorian now recognized as his uncontrolled empathic abilities, were telling him that Arania placed great significance on mind-to-mind communication. Shutting them out completely would be seen as an insult, even if they did happen to have alternative methods of communicating. As they approached the spot where Zorian had first met the Arania during his romp through the sewers with Tivan and her group, he felt a telepathic contact brush against his mind. Like the first time he had met the sentient spiders, this one was cruder, more forceful than the feather-light touch the matriarch had displayed during her visit to Amaya's home. A stream of psychedelic images and alien emotions hit his mind like a sledgehammer, causing him to stumble back in shock. Kale immediately shifted into defensive posture, but Zorian signaled him to stand down. He was pretty sure at this point that the Arania he was in contact with had no hostile intentions. Apparently the minds of humans and Arania were different enough that telepathic communication was difficult, and this particular one never learned how to do it correctly. As suddenly as it came, the communication stopped. The presence remained, however, and Zorian soon felt another Arania connect with him, using the first one as a sort of telepathic relay. "Ah, so you've managed to find us in the end," the distinctive mental voice of the matriarch spoke in his mind. "Good, I was beginning to fear I should have left instructions on how to find us. Stay where you are, please, I will be with you shortly." "She's coming," said Zorian to Kale, who nodded gravely. They didn't have to wait long. The matriarch soon skittered into view, flanked by two other Arania guards. The fact that he was able to pick out the matriarch among the three Arania, despite the fact that all three of them were fairly identical to his eyes, was probably just another proof that he really was empathic. Things like these made him wonder just why he had needed a talking spider to point it out to him before figuring it out. "I originally intended this to be a private talk between just the two of us," the matriarch spoke to his mind. "But since you saw fit to bring a guard, I decided to do likewise." "Oh well, at least you didn't shut me out of your mind like your friend did, so you're still better than most humans I converse with." "Kale isn't here just as a guard," Zorian said, speaking out loud for Kale's benefit. "He is involved in this thing as surely as you are, and I'd like him to participate fully in the discussion. Do you perhaps have a way to communicate vocally for his benefit?" The matriarch seemed to consider it for a moment before she suddenly started waving four of her front legs in front of her, tracing some complex gesture in the air. Zorian tried for a moment to decipher what she was trying to communicate before he realized she wasn't trying to talk to him. She was casting a spell. "There," a feminine voice declared from the direction of the matriarch, though her mandibles didn't move at all. "This is the Arania equivalent of the magic mouth spell that you are no doubt familiar with. It's just a sonic illusion, but it should be enough." "Huh. So they did have more than just mind magic in their arsenal." "I thank you for your consideration," Kale said guardedly, obviously threatened by the spiders but trying to stay polite. "Far from me to refuse such a simple request," the matriarch said guardedly. She was obviously a little suspicious about Kale herself, probably because his mind was protected behind a mind shield spell. The spell made him immune to her abilities, but it also seemed to paint him as a threat to the Arania. "Please, child," the matriarch scoffed. Zorian heard the words with his flesh and blood ears, but he also felt them broadcasted to his mind. She might be vocalizing her words for Kale's benefit, but she clearly wasn't going to give up communicating with Zorian the proper way. I could get past your silly human mind magic any time I wanted to. No, the reason I'm bothered by his mind ward is that it blocks me off from his mind completely. How am I supposed to trust him if he won't even let me read his emotions and surface thoughts? It's rude. Zorian's mind boggled at the mindset that considered putting your surface thoughts up for scrutiny as being basic courtesy, but he supposed that species differences for you. Kale didn't appear to be as understanding. Rude. He demanded, indignant at the accusation. You think you have a right to just barge into people's minds as you please, no permission given or asked, and you call me rude? You spied on my personal memories, damn it, I have every reason to protect myself. The matriarch sent him a telepathic equivalent of a sigh, though no sound was vocalized for Kale's benefit. So did I, she said calmly. Your friend was a possible enemy that I needed to know more about, and you were one of the weak points I could target in order to get the needed information. Your mind was completely unprotected, after all. So why didn't you sift through Zorian's memories, then? Wouldn't that be quicker and more relevant to your quest? Kale asked. Hey! Zorian protested. I have limited myself to skimming his surface thoughts as a courtesy, because he is open, the matriarch said. Among Earnia there is an unofficial custom to ask for permission before delving deeper into the minds of non-enemy psychics, regardless of species. Kale narrowed his eyes. And if a person isn't psychic? Flicker minds are fair game, the Earnia matriarch said dismissively. Alright, let's stop trying to piss each other off now and get back to business, said Zorian with a clap of his hands, hoping to halt the argument before it got out of hand. We were talking about the time loop and how you can help me with that. Before we get to that, though, I really have to ask, when you say I'm open, are you referring to my empathy? Kale gave him a surprised look at that, since Zorian never told him anything about being empathic. Being open implies being empathic, but they are not the same thing. Empathy is just one of the powers available to you, and a bit of a low-hanging fruit at that. That's why you can use it, despite being completely untrained in the psychic arts. Openness often manifests itself as a low, uncontrolled empathy in the beginning, coupled with a gift for divinations and an occasional prophetic dream. What? Fumbled Zorian, trying to wrap his head around this new information. Just when he had thought he had things a little figured out, something like this happened. What the hell is being open or psychic, then? Was she saying he was a full-blown telepath or something? You could be that with enough training, yes, confirmed the matriarch. I can teach you more about it. Provided we come to some kind of mutually acceptable agreement about this time loop business. And what exactly do you want from Zorian in that regard? Asked Kale suspiciously. Why, my dear Kale, the same thing you want from him as well, the matriarch said with a hint of mockery. I want in on this time loop. For a moment Zorian wondered what she was talking about, but then his eyes widened as he understood what she meant. You want to keep your memories with each restart? To loop around with me and Zack? Asked Zorian incredulously. Kale shifted uncomfortably in his spot, refusing to look at him in the eye, while the Earnia matriarch stared straight back at him without a hint of shame on her face. I guess I can see why you would want that, said Zorian hesitantly. I mean, I'm not too happy about my situation, but even I can see that I'm benefiting massively from it. But you seem to have gotten the wrong idea, both of you. He glanced at Kale, but the Morlock was still avoiding his eyes. He probably thought Zorian would be angry at him for wanting to take advantage of him, but Zorian wasn't really angry. Just confused. The thing is, I don't know how to bring anyone into this loop. I don't even know how the details of how I got sucked into it, much less how to replicate it. I can't bring you into it. We didn't get the wrong idea, Zorian, Kale sighed. We're not stupid. We know you can't do it now. We know you won't be able to do it by the time this time loop ends. He gave the matriarch a weak glare. Or at least I know. Maybe the great Earnia matriarch knows something this poor flicker mind doesn't. I agree with the Morlock, the matriarch said, refusing to rise to Kale's provocation. It is highly implausible that you'd be able to bring us into the time loop as you are now. You've completely lost me at this point, Zorian complained. What do you want, then? My idea was to store memory packets in your mind, allowing your soul to ferry them when the time resets itself, the matriarch said nonchalantly. It's not quite as good as having your entire soul sent back, but it would be good enough for my purposes. And I would agree to that. Why? Asked Zorian suspiciously. That sounded like it would require some serious messing with his mind. Far more than he was comfortable with, in any case. I'm sure I can find something to tempt you with, the matriarch said, punctuating her message with a mental shrug. You need information about the loop that I have. You want to learn how to control your empathy. You need my help in countering the invaders. Need I go on? Zorian sighed and turned to Kale instead of answering her. I wanted to connect you with some people and have you figure out, with their help, how your connection with Zack works. Then you could apply that knowledge to bring me into the time loop, said Kale. It would probably take quite a few restarts, and I don't have anything nearly as tempting as our esteemed matriarch over there, but on the other hand it is something that will definitely help you learn more about this time loop and the process. Left unsaid was that those people Kale wanted to connect him with were probably all necromancers, and that having them mess around with his soul was every bit as dangerous as letting the Arania screw around with his mind, and possibly more so. I see, sighed Zorian. Well, I'll set aside Kale's proposal for now, since that's not what we came here to discuss. That's fine with me, Kale said quickly. I still have a lot to think about in that regard. Right, said Zorian. Then let's move on to the details of the matriarch's proposal. Just out of curiosity, do you have a name? If we are going to do business, especially so sensitive, I'd like to know who exactly I'm talking to. The matriarch didn't answer verbally. Instead, she sent a short burst of telepathy containing the same sort of psychedelic jumble of images and concepts that the less skilled Arania bombarded him with in the initial greeting. Thankfully, this particular burst wasn't painful, just confusing, probably because it was so relatively short. After mentally dissecting the chaotic message in his head, he realized this was the name he asked for. Translating the concepts into something appropriate for human communication proved a bit of a challenge, however. Spear of Resolve striking straight at the heart of the matter? Questioned Zorian curiously. As good an approximation of my real name as any, said the matriarch. And yes, I know that's too unwieldy to use in human conversation. Your language is very crude, so it's hard to translate Arania names into it without ending up with such overdramatic sounding drivel. You can just continue calling me matriarch and I won't hold it against you. Kale snorted derisively at the matriarch's swipe against human speech, but didn't say anything. Zorian, for his part, was considering how to proceed. All right then, said Zorian. You told me that there is a reason why you took the time loop seriously. Why don't you tell us what you mean by that? Before the matriarch could answer, a loud roar pierced through the relative silence of the tunnel, quickly followed by several more similar ones. Color drained out of Zorian's face as he realized the identity of the creatures that produced the roar. A band of war trolls were coming their way. Chapter 018 The Pact is Sealed. He should have known, really, every time he got even slightly closer to getting to the bottom of this mess, some complication sprang up to hamper his progress. It was uncanny. He was half tempted to conclude the as of yet unconfirmed third time traveler was messing with him, but he would have expected something far more decisive than a pack of war trolls if that were the case. And now that he thought about it, it was kind of scary how radically his perspective must have shifted during the last year if he started considering troll warbands a nuisance rather than an existential threat. Not this again, the Arania matriarch complained telepathically. How do those things keep finding us? I had the whole web warded against divinations and everything. Zorian filed in the back of his mind the fact that this wasn't the first time the matriarch encountered the war trolls, but at the moment he didn't really have enough time to consider that little tidbit in any appreciable detail. He exchanged a knowing look with Kale, and then they both turned around and started running in the direction they came from. Zorian motioned for the Arania to follow after them, and received a thought of assent from the matriarch in turn. "We can't outrun them," the matriarch noted as they ran. "Especially us Arania, aside from short bursts of speed, we're actually a lot slower than humans." "It's fine," Zorian thought, certain that the Arania would pick up on it. Me and Kale prepared a couple of surprises for pursuers behind us. They should slow the trolls down enough for us to reach the surface. "Ah. An insurance against me in case the talks turned sour?" the matriarch surmised. "You hit it well from my surface scans. I would have been caught totally off guard if I had truly planned to double-cross you. Then again, I don't think I could have caught up to you if you decided to run anyway, so it was mostly a wasted effort. Or would have been, had there been no war trolls." Information on Arania running speed is a tad hard to come by in human books, Zorian thought irritably, slowing down to let the Arania overtake him. They were just about to pass the first trap, and he didn't want to seal the Arania on the other side of the force field along with the trolls. "Can't you use your mind magic to pacify those things?" The war trolls rounded a corner in a tightly packed mass of green flesh, howling like lunatics and waving their huge swords and masses around like they were twigs, but Zorian was ready at that point. He sent a pulse of mana into the pair of nearby cubes covered with sigils, and a sheet of force sealed the corridor. It wouldn't last long if a bunch of trolls kept beating at it, but he never counted on it being an insurmountable obstacle in the first place. Sadly, whoever is controlling them has learned to shield their minds against this after the first few conflicts, the matriarch said. "It's not foolproof, but we won't be able to pick their defenses apart before they smash us into pulp." There was a terrible racket behind them, and Zorian chanced to glance back to the barrier to see what was happening. The sight that greeted him brought a pleased smile to his lips. The trolls had apparently failed to arrest their momentum properly and ended up crashing headfirst into the barrier. Probably because the relatively narrow corridor didn't allow the trolls to advance in a single line, and the ones in the back didn't let the ones in the front break up the mad charge. Or maybe they just didn't recognize the force field for what it was. No matter, the point was that they were currently all tangled on the floor in a great big confused mass, and would take some time to reorganize. That should give them enough of a lead to escape cleanly, even with the slowpoke Arania weighing them down. Just to make sure, he activated the next two barrier traps as well, but the two cubes holding explosive traps he simply scooped up and took with him. They were weapons of desperation, truth be told, and he wasn't sure if he could activate them without blowing himself up along with the target. Besides, he was pretty sure they didn't have enough power to seriously damage a troll, being designed to handle much squishier targets. Zorian was worried about how they were going to smuggle a trio of giant spiders past the entrance guards, but he needn't have worried. The Arania seemed to be able to edit other people's senses in real time, effectively erasing their presence to the victim. Zorian had to admit he hadn't thought the Arania's mind magic was quite so subtle. It would appear he was still taking them far too lightly. But anyway, they were back on the surface and totally safe. He hadn't expected the whole thing to end so favorably. When he realized a pack of trolls was coming after them, he fully expected he was heading for an early restart. It seemed good things did happen to good people occasionally. Still, as happy as he was at his current fortune, his talk with the Arania wasn't finished yet, so the four of them quickly relocated themselves in a deserted alley to continue their conversation. "We should be safe enough to talk here," the matriarch said in her magically assisted voice. "I can't sense the presence of any minds that don't belong here. Not even those blasted cephalic rats." "The what?" asked Zorian. "Another psychic creature we've recently come to share this city with," the matriarch groused. "They look much like regular rats, except the top of their head looks like it has been sawn off, leaving their brains visible." "Oh," Zorian said. "I actually saw something like that once, back in my original live-through of this month. I never went down that street in any of the subsequent restarts, though. Probably for the best," the matriarch said. "It is likely they are working for the invasion forces. They only appeared recently, and the trolls started harassing us when we tried to exterminate them." "Are the rats intelligent?" asked Kale. You seem to be implying they're some kind of spies, yes? They're psychic, like us, the matriarch said. Their minds are telepathically linked to one another, forming a collective intelligence. Individually, they're little more than particularly cunning rats, but the more of them group together, the smarter they get. And the stronger their telepathic abilities become. They are small enough to get anywhere, and the death of any particular rat is inconsequential. Each one acts as a relay for the full power and intelligence of the entire swarm. They are almost perfect spies, better than even us Arania. As I said, we tried to get rid of them before they could muscle in on our territory. But we failed to account for the fact they weren't working alone. Crap, Zorian said. With those things running around the city, it's no wonder the invaders are so well informed. They could be pulling information straight out of people's minds without anybody realizing it. All they need is to find one person that is privy to sensitive information and whose mind is unprotected, and they can blow a hole in the whole system. Yes, the matriarch confirmed. Arania can do something similar, but not nearly to the same extent. We're too big to move as freely through human settlements as cephalic rats do, and our individual members are not as expendable as individual cephalic rats. They can get into many places where we can't, especially warded ones. Giant spiders trip defensive wards in ways that a couple of funny-looking rats do not. Zorian frowned as he suddenly realized something. With these cephalic rats on the loose in the city and working with the invaders, there was no way the invasion organizers remained ignorant of the time loop in every single restart. Zorian himself had not advertised his situation much, but Zack did. Sometimes very visibly and explicitly, if Zack hadn't been speaking in hyperbole when Zorian talked to him. So whoever was controlling the cephalic rats knew about Zack being a time traveler in at least some of the restarts. And never did anything about it. Zorian found it difficult to explain. Did they just refuse to believe what their agents on the ground were telling them? That sounded uncharacteristically sloppy considering how well the invaders seemed to be organized otherwise. An interesting point, the matriarch said, breaking him out of his thoughts. I'm beginning to understand why you're so reluctant to deal openly with this Zack. But we're getting distracted here, dancing around the real issue. You heard my offer, Zorian. I have been very generous about my information thus far, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to put my foot down now. I want a straight answer. Will you let me send a memory packet through you or not? Zorian sighed. What a difficult question. He wanted, no, needed, what the matriarch was offering. But he really didn't trust her with this. And really, how could he? Mind magic was only a hair's breadth better than soul magic in terms of abuse potential, and that was only because mind magic had well-established counters whereas soul magic did not. You're asking a lot, Zorian complained. I offer a lot, the matriarch countered. And besides, I'm taking as big of a risk here as you do. I have no guarantee that you will actually track me down in each restart and alert me to the memories I stored inside your mind. What stops you from playing along for a few restarts, until you've gotten everything you wanted from me, and then meticulously avoiding contact with me for the rest of the time loop? Nothing. I have taken a leap of faith and decided to trust you. Is it so wrong to expect a similar commitment from you in turn? A short silence descended on the scene as Zorian digested her words in his head. He supposed there was some merit in what she was saying, though he wasn't quite buying the idea that she was risking as much as he was. His risk was more final and immediate than hers. Oh well. No pain, no gain. Fine, he said. I agree to your terms. Break. You are a braver man than I, Kale told him as they slowly walked back to Amaya's place. Zorian absent-mindedly rubbed his forehead instead of giving him a proper answer. He didn't feel noticeably different after the Arania was finished with the procedure, to be honest. Kale was worried about possible dormant command spells that the matriarch may have implanted along with the memory packet, but I actually had a reason to think it might not be as dangerous as it sounded, Zorian finally said. Oh. Kale prompted. Yeah. I researched the limitations of mind magic before we went to talk to the matriarch, both the classical spellcasting type and the telepathic abilities of magical creatures known to use them. I even asked Elsa and our combat magic instructor for advice. I probably made them really suspicious of what the hell I'm doing, but whatever. Anyway, everyone seems to agree that even expert mind mages can't just rewrite someone's brain on a whim, or in a stealthy manner. It takes a great deal of time, and you basically have to knock the victim unconscious, or they will be fully aware of what you're trying to do to them and fight it with everything they got, physically and mentally. If the matriarch tried to do something truly terrible to me, we would have known quickly enough. I'm not really sure I could have done much for you, even if I noticed the deal had gone bad, Kale said. I do have some modest combat skills, but I doubt they'd be enough to fight off 3 giant spiders that are all within jumping distance of me. It doesn't matter, said Zorian, reaching into his pocket to retrieve one of his 2 unspent explosive cubes. He held the stone cube in his palm so Kale could see it. All I had to do was send a pulse of mana into these, and both me and the matriarch would have ended up in pieces. I very much doubt the matriarch could have incapacitated me faster than I can pulse my mana. Suicide? Kale asked, sounding surprised. He shook his head. I stand by what I said. You're a braver man than I, as Zack once told me. The time loop skews your perspective on dying, said Zorian, putting the cube back in his pocket. Now that he thought about it, his impromptu security system reminded him of the similar system that protected Zack from the Lich's soul melt spell. He should probably start carrying something like this all the time, just in case. Something way lighter and less noticeable than 2 big stone cubes, though. It's still possible she used something less comprehensive than a full personality rewrite on you, though, Kale said after a few seconds. I know, Zorian said. But you heard what she said at the end. The memory packet should last for a year, at minimum. I plan to avoid the area in the next several restarts while I look for a way to examine my mind for such things. Even if the magical expertise is beyond me, I'm sure I can find an expert to hire so they can take a look at me. Ah. Good idea, Kale nodded. Of course, that means it will be a while before you can question the matriarch again. She did say she wasn't saying anything until you deliver the memories to her reborn self in the next restart. An acceptable delay, Zorian shrugged. It wasn't like he had nothing to do while he waited, and Zack had indicated he would be spending the next several restarts in Seoria as well. Hell, even in this particular restart he had to see what Slush would do about the invasion and what Zorian could do to help him. If he ended up staying in Seoria during the summer festival at all, that is. He wasn't sure he wanted to do that, all things considered. So, do you want to tell me your master plan for getting yourself into this time loop now or later? Later, Kale grumbled. I haven't even ironed out all the details in my head yet. Stupid spider and her big mandibles. I'm pretty sure her speech didn't involve mandibles in any way, actually, Zorian said. It was a pure sound illusion. Really? Wasn't my mind shield spell supposed to protect me from mind effects like illusions, even if they're beneficial? Asked Kale, frowning in confusion. The matriarch's spell wasn't targeting your mind. It created actual sound waves, said Zorian. But then it's a sound spell, not an illusion, no? Kale stated more than asked. Officially, any spell that creates fake scenery is an illusion, regardless of the means it uses to do so. Many illusions are made primarily out of actual light and sound, but they're still illusions. That's surprisingly imprecise, Kale said. I understand it's because a lot of actual structured spells from illusionary disciplines combine mental illusions with, well, let's call them physical ones. Theoretically, you could separate the two into different categories, and many tried, but in the end the Eldamarmage Guild decided to just admit defeat and lump them together. How surprisingly practical of the guild, then, Kale said. I guess even they get an attack of common sense from time to time. Zorian said nothing. He didn't need empathy to deduce that his Morlock companion had a bit of a grudge against the guild for some reason. Personally, Zorian thought the Mage Guild was doing a pretty good job overall, but he wasn't so impressed with them that he would defend them in front of others. The rest of the walk passed in relative silence. Break. As the start of the summer festival approached, Zorian became more and more certain that Haslush wasn't going to do much about the invasion. He wasn't sure whether the man had decided Zorian's suspicions were merely a rumor or whether he was ordered to drop the issue, but he no longer seemed very interested in the whole matter. For Zorian, this was a sign that he should take Kirill and get out of the city before the invasion starts. He had no interest in getting murdered by the invaders again, and even less in having Kirill die alongside of him. He would have to see whether he could talk Kale and Imaya into leaving with him. But although the date was fast approaching, such problems weren't a pressing concern yet. Currently, he just wanted to have something to eat and lie down a little. Kiridashli had given him some truly mind-numbing tasks to perform today, and he wasn't in the mood for plotting. Conveniently, the moment he walked into the house he was assaulted by the smell of food wafting from the kitchen. Imaya's insistence on keeping her informed of his comings and goings was somewhat annoying, but Zorian had to admit it was convenient how she timed her meals to match his and Kale's schedule. He entered the kitchen and was immediately tackled by Kirill. "Brother, I hurt my hand," she wailed, waving her hand in front of his face. "Hurry, you have to heal it." Zorian snatched her wrist to stop her from moving her hand so much and inspected the grievous injury. It was a shallow cut, a scratch really, that would probably heal on its own by the end of the day. Out of the corner of his eyes he could see Maya trying not to laugh. Zorian suppressed the urge to sigh. He knew his family would make fun of him if they knew he was an empath, but he honestly didn't expect Kirill to descend to this level. She knew he wasn't a healer, association between empathy and the healing arts notwithstanding. Though considering his excellent mana-shaping skills, he would probably make a good healer with enough training. Something to consider, at least. Schooling his face into a serious expression, he slowly turned Kirill's injured hand this way or that, pretending to study it in detail. Finally, after a thoughtful hum, he looked Kirill straight in the eye. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done, miss. We will have to cut it off," he concluded gravely. He then turned towards Kana, who was sitting at the table but studiously watching the entire exchange, and gave her a deep, meaningful look. "Fetch the saw." Kana nodded seriously at him and motioned to leave the table, only to get stopped by a laughing Imaya who assured her that he was just joking. Zorian was pretty sure the little girl understood that all too well and was just playing along. Did they even have a saw in the house? In any case, Kirill wrenched her wrist out of his grasp at his declaration and pointed at him. "Jerk," she declared, sticking her tongue out at him. The meal was relatively quiet, except for occasional outbursts from Kirill. But that was Kirill for you. She was a loud person by nature, though Zorian was pleased to say she did have calm periods from time to time. Mostly when she was reading or drawing. It still surprised him a little every time he saw her do that, since it seemed rather out of character for someone like Kirill to be so absorbed into a book or a drawing. Doubly so because he knew from personal experience that mother and father didn't think much of hobbies like that and tried to discourage them as much as possible. After the meal, Zorian retreated back to his room, Kirill following after him. Zorian didn't feel in the mood to chase her off and let her, but she seemed to be in a fairly agreeable mood today and left him largely at peace. He was currently sitting cross-legged while practicing his shaping skills, while Kirill was lying on her stomach and drawing something on the floor, a small pile of papers scattered around her. Eventually, though, her pen stopped moving and she spent the next several minutes nervously chewing on the tip of it. Zorian was versed well enough in her tics by now to know his peace and quiet would end soon after. "Zorian?" she suddenly asked. "Yeah." He sighed. "Why do you study so hard?" she asked, giving him a curious look. "Even though nothing really matters in this time loop you're stuck in, you still keep working all the time. Don't you want to have fun from time to time?" "You're wrong," Zorian said. "First of all, everything matters. You're what you do, and if I were to start doing stupid things just because there is seemingly no consequence for them, those actions would eventually come to define me. Secondly, I actually find studying fun. Well, maybe not all of it, but you get the idea." There was a short silence, but Kirill seemed reluctant to continue the conversation, even though she clearly wanted to say something. Zorian decided to help her out. "Why do you ask? Is there something you would rather be doing?" Kirill's eyes darted between him and the pile of drawings on the floor several times, before she finally reached a decision. She scooped up the papers into a neat stack and promptly plopped into Zorian's lap. "Can you look at my drawings and tell me what you think?" she asked excitedly. Oh. Well, that wasn't too bad. He never paid much attention to her drawings, especially since she tended to hide them whenever he tried to get a better look, but from what he had glimpsed they were pretty good. Hell, he was feeling in a good mood, so he wouldn't even mock her. Too much. Damn. Zorian watched and listened in silence, and Kirill animatedly showed off the fruits of her labor, explaining what the drawings represented. Not that she needed to do so, because the drawings were frighteningly realistic. She wasn't just good, she was freaking amazing. Zorian could swear he was looking at drawings of a professional artist rather than some childish drawings of his little sister. One of the drawings was a very detailed scene of Sioria's cityscape that was so chock full of little details that Zorian was shocked Kirill actually had the patience to put them down to paper, never mind draw them properly. "Kirill, those are absolutely amazing," he said honestly. He had intended to make a few jabs at her skill at first, but he honestly couldn't see anything remotely worth mocking in these. Why on earth is Mother not bragging to everyone about having a budding little artist for a daughter? Kirill shifted uncomfortably in his lap. Mother doesn't approve of me drawing. She won't buy me any supplies, and she yells at me whenever she catches me doing that. Zorian gave her a baffled look. What? Why on earth would she do that? Mother was close-minded and status-obsessed, but not actively malicious or anything. He picked up Kirill's stack of drawings and leafed through it again, stopping at a very nice portrait of Bern, the boy he and Kirill interacted with on the train to Sioria. Kirill had never even seen the boy after that day, yet she was able to create a very faithful rendition of him, presumably by working from memory alone. "Wait," he said suddenly. "Is that why you keep stealing my notebooks and writing supplies?" "Ah. I thought you didn't even notice," she admitted. "Since you never complained about it to Mother. Thanks for that, by the way." Well, he never said anything because he thought Mother wouldn't do anything about it, even if she knew. But hey, all was well that ended well, and he certainly wasn't going to tell Kirill the truth and destroy whatever gratitude he'd just earned. What about the books, then? I suppose she disapproved of those too? Zorian guessed. Yeah, Kirill said, clutching her drawings close to her chest. She won't buy me any. She says a lady shouldn't waste time with such things. That he actually expected, truth be told. Mother didn't like it when he spent his time reading, so he imagined she would be none too happy to see her darling daughter picking up such a hobby. Still didn't explain why she didn't want Kirill to draw, though. Well, that's Mother for you, said Zorian. She seemed to be getting rather upset, and Zorian could totally understand. It would appear her situation had more similarities to his own than he had ever dreamed about. Don't worry about it. It was the same with me at first. She'll lay off once she sees she can't bully you into submission. It's not the same. Kirill suddenly snapped at him. Now what? Kire. You don't get it. It's not the same because you're away from home most of the year and she can't do anything to you while you're away. You and Damon and Fertov are here, learning magic and doing whatever you want, and I'll never get to do that. She buried her head in Zorian's chest, her tiny little fingers digging painfully into his arms. It's not the same because I'm a girl. Zorian wrapped his arms around Kirill, rocking her gently to calm her down while he digested what she was telling him. Finally, a realization hit him. Traditionalists in certain often held a view that educating female children was a waste of time and money. Hell, some of them even went against the law and refused to send their daughters into elementary school to learn how to read and write. It didn't help that mage academies tended to be rather expensive, even lower quality ones. They aren't going to send you to a mage academy. Zorian concluded out loud. Kirill shook her head, her face still buried in his chest. They say I don't need it, she said, sniffing sadly. "They already have a marriage arranged for me for when I turn 15. "Well, isn't that nice for them?" said Zorian coldly. "You know what, Carrie? You're right. It's not the same. I had to defy mother and father all by myself. You, on the other hand, have me." Carrie peeled her face from his chest and gave him a searching look. "You never wanted to help me before," she accused. "Every time I asked you to teach me magic you blew me off." "I didn't know what you were dealing with," Zorian shrugged. "I thought you were just impatient and didn't want to waste my time on something you were going to learn in due time anyway. But rest assured, if mother and father don't change their minds over the years, you will always have a teacher in me." She stared at him for a few seconds before she snatched one of his arms by the wrist and gripped it in an oath-making position. "Promise?" she asked. Zorian squeezed her hand tighter, eliciting a yelp from her. "Promise," he confirmed. Break. 2 days before the summer festival, Kale finally laid out his plan to Zorian. It was a lot less concrete than the matriarch's one, and basically involved talking to a number of individuals that Kale thought might know something about soul magic or time travel. None of them were in Seoria, though, and would require Zorian to basically blow off school in order to travel across the country and in some cases even across borders. The Morlock also hinted that he knew a couple of individuals living in the Great Northern Forest, but he admitted it might be a bad idea to visit those until he could actually defend himself properly. Zorian memorized the names and locations, but it would be a while until he could visit any of them. The end of the restart was totally uneventful. He, Kirill, Kale and Kana boarded the train heading out of Seoria on the night of the festival and spent the last remaining hours playing card games to pass the time. Imaya refused to go with them, which was fairly unsurprising, given the suddenness of their request and the sketchy nature of their warnings. And then, like always, Zorian woke up in Surin, Kirill wishing him a good morning. He didn't take her with him this time, which turned out to be a good idea, as Zack did indeed come to class in that particular restart. The other time traveler tried to strike up a conversation with him, but Zorian was determined to avoid him and gave him a cold shoulder. After a few days, Zack seemed to admit defeat and gave up, but Zorian could see that the other boy was watching him way more closely than he did most people. Zorian's freedom to act as he saw fit was consequently somewhat limited, and he mostly amused himself with honing his shaping skills, combat magic, divinations, and spell formula. Tivan was not informed of the rumors behind giant telepathic spiders in the sewers, as he didn't want to meet the matriarch just yet. An entire restart passed in this fashion. And the next one. And the next. In total, it took 6 restarts before Zack stopped approaching him at the start of each restart and otherwise pay attention to him. Despite this, Zorian was pleased with what he had accomplished. He had spent 3 of the 6 restarts learning from the ever-enthusiastic Norabul. The other 3 restarts were spent learning from Haslush and had gotten skilled enough at spell formula to create a lighter, more inconspicuous version of his explosive suicide switch. It was still a cube, though a much smaller one made of a combination of wood and stone. He made 2 of them in each restart now and attached them to his key so they would appear as an ornament. He had also found a mage specializing in mind magic and had him inspect his mind for implanted compulsions and other nasty surprises. Sadly, the man was rather baffled by the memory packet and couldn't confirm it only contained memories. He did confirm, however, that it was currently dormant, and also that no other magical effect was currently active in his mind. If there was some kind of trap in the memory packet, it had yet to activate. The 7th restart saw Zack still in class, but he appeared to have finally given up on Zorian as a lost cause. It was time to get down to business,